Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this workshop, two-day workshop on how does the Pacific fit into the Indo-Pacific. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce an old friend of mine, Collin Beck, whose current job is as the Permanent Secretary of the Solomon Islands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and External Trade. And Collin, the Australian Prime Minister, has just made his first visit of this term of office to your country, and so it's an extremely timely thing for you to come and honour us with a few remarks this morning. Collin is one of the Pacific Islands' most distinguished diplomats. He's had a long career in the Foreign Ministry in Solomon Islands. Before his current job, he was well known to many of us here as Solomon Islands High Commissioner to Australia, and before that he was based in New York as Solomon Islands Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and also you were accredited as Ambassador to the United States, Canada and Cuba, if I have that right. So Collin comes to us with an enormous fund of experience and professional expertise. So I'm greatly honoured to invite you to come and talk to us this morning. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning all. Thank you, James. Once again, let me begin by not only thanking you all for making time for this, but also for to all professors, associate professors, senior lecturers. I've seen one or two members of the diplomatic corps. Also, thank you for being here. Public servants who are also in the room, thank you very much for being here. And all friends and wantoks from the Pacific. And I also wish to make a special recognition, really, to two of Solomon Islands great friends, in which we have given them awarded them a special award as former Regional Assistance Mission Coordinators, James Batley and Tim George. Tim George is probably, this is around, just to acknowledge them, and as well as fellow countrymen from Solomons who are in the room. Let me also join James Batley, really, in beginning with the traditional customary welcome in terms of acknowledgement, to the inaugural traditional leaders, past, present and future, whose ancestral land we hold this gathering, and to them we give them our respect. I also thank the Australian National University, really, for giving me the space and the support to say something on the Pacific aspirations in freeing our people from want, development, freeing our people from fear, security, and to live in dignity, human rights from an international perspective. The timeliness of this workshop is impeccable. Impeccable, I think, not only because of the recent visit by the Australian Prime Minister to Solomon Islands, but mainly because a number of foreign policies are now being reviewed in the region. A number of Pacific countries are now measuring and weighing their relationship, guided by the international interest. All this is done at a time when Australia, under its 2017 foreign policy, is also testing out new ideas in strengthening both regional cooperation and integration. Australia's outreach to the Pacific has increased. Pacific leaders' guest of government visits to Australia has also increased. And during my time in the last 2 years, we basically had two prime ministerial visits from Solomon Islands to Australia. Australia's Prime Minister's outreach also to the Pacific, not only to Fiji, to Vanuatu, more or less indicates the Australia step up in its relations with the Pacific. Well, looking at the growing challenges of the Pacific, looking at the growing challenges of the Pacific, time is of essence in trying to meaningfully, I think, translate the priorities of the region into action. Some of the issues relating to the Pacific more or less is about really the youth bulge in the region, which is basically a concern. And if I use the Solomon Islands context, annually we have 18,000 youth looking for jobs, and only 3,000 to 4,000 actually find jobs. Now, when we put this into a regional context, you're basically talking about the entire population of Tuvalu and 95% of Nauru's population put together. But within our capital city, you can put more of the small island states inside our capital city. We're really talking about, and the number is really around 80 to 100,000 population. We'll be having our census this year, which probably will give us new information, but the number of population is quite high. We are also very fertile. Fertile in the sense that we have a fast rising population and a declining natural resources. That's also another challenge that we are having. Our economy is not growing fast enough to keep up with our development needs. And the onslaught of climate change is really creating pockets of poverty. There are also new health issues emerging due to climate change, biosecurity also. New health issues. In the case of Solomons, we never had dengue until the last couple of years. These are all new coming in. We have rhinoceros beetles and African snails and so forth. But the point is, I think we just cannot miscalculate our actions going forward. So I think this makes the workshop here very very important. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you have this workshop in terms of navigating the Pacific geopolitical landscape today and tomorrow, in unpacking and analyzing the dynamics and challenges faced by the region, we should be asking three questions: the where, the what, and the how. First, the where. Where is the Pacific in the fast-changing international system? The what are the challenges, and what do the Pacific needs to do to guarantee a sustainable future? And finally, the how. How do we unlock and translate the region's priorities into action with finance, technology, capacity, within a transformative partnership that will prepare our people to what is to come? I will speak more on that particular challenge that is facing the Pacific. But overall, I'm really humbled really to be amongst not only friends of the Pacific in this room, but also the wealth of knowledge and interest in the Pacific. And I hope this workshop will first of all breathe in all regional problems and breathe out new solutions. Because the region basically needs new thinking in managing its affairs. I also hope this discussion will also provide some sense of direction for the region to consider signposts in identifying what needs to change to open opportunities and prosperity. This can only happen, I think, when we go into panel discussion. This can only happen if we have an honest, open, frank, and interactive discussion on what we should be looking at. Let me now speak generally on the changing international system. The shift in the international system with the rise of emerging powers. And when I say rise of emerging powers, I'm talking about China, I'm talking about India, I'm talking about Brazil, I'm talking about South Africa, Russia. And also the decline of traditional power that have basically also redefined engagements in the Pacific. Looking into history, United States actually have withdrew from the region back in soon after the Cold War. It actually closed its embassy in the Solomons back in 1992 and managed its relations post-Cold War from two locations, Port Moresby and Suva. Port Moresby to cover the Melanesian countries and Suva for the other Pacific countries. Australia, so the vacuum created by the United States have more or less been left in particular to Australia and New Zealand to fill. Past Australian foreign policy have viewed the Pacific through a security lens, viewing surrounding countries as axis of instability. I think the developments, more or less, it's evidence-based in a way that the Bougainville conflict, 1988 to 2001, Solomon Islands ethnic conflict, 1998-2000, and the various coups in Fiji. In other words, Solomon Islands, Australia looked to Asia for business and the Pacific for stability. It has successfully managed its relations globally, enjoying stable economic growth for the last 28 years running concurrently. This year will be the 29th year. Australia's 2017 foreign policy white paper, from our perspective, takes a fresh look at the Pacific. It speaks of Australia's global interest in having a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific region, preventing any coercive external influence, and also not allowing any countries within its neighborhood to fail, and also by working to build constructive ties with China, all operating within the rules-based international system. But as we enter the new century, since beginning the 2000s, there's been also a proliferation of regional organizations emerging in the Pacific. Regional cooperation outputs have been mixed. Conflicts in the Solomons have brought forth the best of Pacific diplomacy, and as I've said in past gatherings, it has been not only the best of Pacific diplomacy, but creme de la creme island solidarity and the finest cooperation, emerging with a model of peacekeeping, peace building, and peacemaking, all rolled into one. Regional cooperation is it's only successful when it is country focused. I think that's probably a point I wish to underscore. But certainly there are important lessons in which regional positions we have taken, in particular to Fiji, have more or less, I think, have allowed us to reflect on more, in the sense that new institutions also have emerged out of trying to impose sanctions, trying to impose isolation out of a member of the forum. So the Pacific Island Development Forum more or less grew out of that as well. The new geopolitical lines drawn with the rise of China, Australia has adopted a step-up Pacific policy, and New Zealand has pressed the Pacific reset button. United States also is beginning to re-engage itself and also considering re-establishing itself within the Pacific, especially at the country level. In the case of Solomon Islands, we are basically meeting Washington-based representative on a monthly basis, both from State Department as well as White House. We are also talking to them on the Millennium Challenge Corporation threshold program. The United States is also considering re-establishing its embassy back in the Solomons. So all these are basically new developments. We know that we're going to have more visits this month as well, looking at the return of Peace Corps and so forth. So all these are basically all happening as I speak. Now, how has the Pacific responded to all these changes? It has looked within itself and formed the Pacific Small Island developing states, mainly to champion its collective interests globally. On development issues, it has more or less voted as a bloc and taken on a lot of global responsibilities, placing PCID's candidates in selected global positions and trying to participate in leading global negotiations. This is also something that is homegrown, coming only from within the Pacific SIDS, not necessarily the forum. So it's just, I will try to explain that later into my talk in terms of why PCIDS rose outside out of forum, in terms of supporting the forum, not working against the forum. The Pacific Islands have more or less done so but first of all done so by managing its internal dynamics. The characteristics of the region is so diverse and deep that islanders actually knows what works and what does not work. If I can just give an example, it's basically, when we talk about fisheries, when we talk about oceans, within the Pacific, we tend to leave it to the 8 PNA members, parties to the Nauru Agreement. Out of the FFA members, it's the PNA members that take the leadership on all these discussions. On climate change, also, we look within ourselves and we identify not only the vulnerable, but those who are sitting on the hotspots of climate change. So it's basically Tuvalu, Nauru, Solomon Islands, in terms of taking leadership on climate change discussions. Now, the Pacific SIDS are also mindful that outcomes of many of the regional gatherings that we have, from climate change to political issues, are not necessarily ambitious. Not necessarily, it's actually based on internal negotiations amongst the Pacific Island foreign countries. So when that basically happens and we have an outcome, usually to bring everyone together, most times you have the lowest common denominator. So this is the reason why PCIDS on certain issues, they had to be more ambitious on certain areas, stronger than building on what the platform placed by the forum in terms of sending a strong global message from the region. So the Pacific has basically taken much more ambitious not only positions, but trying also to fill in gaps not provided for by the region. I say gaps in the sense that the Pacific Small Islands developing states have been sending students to Cuba for medical studies, basically because the regional framework has given each country quota that is not sufficient to meet their health needs, that they need to. So this has more or less pushed some of the outsourcing some of the corporations that we have outside of our region. In the case of Solomon Islands, we have already so far have 76 graduated medical students in the last couple of years. 76, 45 have already been registered. The others are going through the bridging program. Having said this, the journey of each and every Pacific countries are not the same within our in terms of our international system, and I wish to underscore that. All this varying perspectives are shaped by our different development status for the Pacific countries are classified as least developed countries. They are basically the orphans of the region. There is no regional mechanism that deals with these 4 countries. Within the forum, you have small island states, but you don't have anyone to deal with the least developed countries. So they tend to try to find that cooperation also outside of the region. 12 of the 16 members of the forum, small island developing states, are members of the United Nations. 12 out of the 16. All of them belong to the Asia-Pacific regional group at global level. So with 3 of the forum members, well, 2 in particular, Australia and New Zealand belongs to the Western and Europe group in terms. So you see, when you look at the global level, you see the forum actually divided, and the negotiations are conducted on different sides of the table. But if we add France, because French Polynesia and New Caledonia, then you have 3 in the Western Europe and other states group. 2 of the members of the forum are on the UN decolonization list. The dynamics of the forum have changed in a way that it has also outsourced a good number of issues that now will be going to sub-regional groupings within the Pacific in terms of championing these issues. So these have more or less shaken a lot of new changes in terms of engagements within the regional setting. 6 of the Pacific seats have relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan. The remaining have relations with the People's Republic of China. That in itself has its own dynamics in terms of the engagement. Meetings of post-forum dialogue meetings with PRC is not necessarily held in the same room as Taiwan. So you have the Pacific actually, there are some who have to move out to another venue, and it depends on who is hosting the forum. And that more or less, more or less determines, where you're going to have that meeting, going to that particular meeting. But let me just say something on the level of integration also. I'm still trying to put that picture of the characteristics of what makes the Pacific move. And the level of integration is another thing within the Pacific, is also differ amongst the PCIDs. Northern Pacific countries, especially the compact countries, have a closer integrated relationship with the United States of America. While Cook Islands, Niue in the south are politically associated with New Zealand. So these are some of the dynamics that are there, in which once there are difficulties, there are some within the forum who basically have no other options but to try to solve them from within. In terms of, because the others have options in terms of with their relationship with other metropolitan countries. So that is also another something that I thought I'd put in. But I think when we look at the region, we have 9 regional organizations serving the Pacific. This has actually made the Pacific one of the most workshopped region in the world. This has made the Pacific one of the most consult-driven region in the world. For Solomon Islands, we have a program with SPC, 43 million SPD dollars. the bulk of it is all consultants. And this is going into the next couple of years. So that's, I think we need to change the way we do business in the Pacific. And I think, to me, sometimes the organization somehow needs to focus on one or two areas and try to make a difference, but not to do too many things too thinly, and eventually we don't see anything in terms of output out of it. All 9 organizations actually compete for attention and resources, and this comes at a huge cost to member states because we annually pay contributions to each of these 9 organizations. So we are basically talking about 9 layers of bureaucracy, 9 photocopy machines. I'm just throwing in some of these things, all serving the same member countries, all serving the same member. So I hope in our discussions when we look at the subject that is before us, we need to also look at the regional architecture. If it needs to be, it has to be reformed. And if I'm going to throw in some of my thoughts on it, I'm really thinking that it should try to think sub-regionally. Sub-regionally because the problems of some sub-regionally are much more closer. Sometimes it's difficult to compare a population of 1,500 Niue, for example, to Papua New Guinea, 8 million plus people. So the outputs of the region sometimes are too small for some of the countries that are facing much more bigger problems. So I think if we start to try to think in that way, I think it might be a way of bringing back efficiency, making regional cooperation more relevant and much more closer to the people. Secondly, I think I think the concept of equity also needs to be redefined in terms of allocation of quotas. I think allocation of quotas must be proportioned to population. And I say this going back to the Cuban situation, in which we are given 5 spaces for medical students going to Suva. And for a population of 600,000, this is just not sufficient for our needs. So this is why we have sent more than 100 students over to Cuba. We have established an embassy there, and we are trying to now expand beyond the medical scholarships to other specialized areas going forward. But I think it can be cheaper if we can try to look within the region and try to see how we can deal with some of these challenges. The Pacific being large, let me now turn to ocean. The Pacific, despite being large ocean states, all regional organizations are doing something on ocean, but not deep enough to make an impact. Ocean is basically being dealt in silos within the region and on a piecemeal basis. It's all over the place. And if I can just put this into perspective, when we look at who is the Commissioner of Ocean, it's the Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. SPRED does something on ocean, assessing the health of the ocean. FFA does something in terms of fisheries, SPC on coastal management, USP on education, and so forth and so forth. So basically, there are issues closer to the island countries we are not paying attention to. And I think not only the issue of ocean needs to come under one roof, but investments on extending Pacific sovereignty in supporting countries' continental shelf claims have also been sought outside of the region. It's not being provided. This is the saddest thing. You know, we can do more within the Pacific in terms of extending sovereignty, and we're not investing sufficiently on that. Secondly, the pulling of resources in terms of trying to map out our coastal areas. Many of the Pacific countries are also not receiving this sort of development-oriented attention within the regional arrangements. One thing that I, having taken the post in the last 7 months, is that I've developed a branch dealing with two things: climate change and ocean. And we're now chairing the implementation of ocean within the whole government system, working with 11 other line ministries as leaders of trying to do that. But our vision is basically to have one ocean authority. Looking at the Pacific, and I think looking at the Pacific and trying to see beyond the current arrangements that we have, we basically have oversold the concept of regionalism so much that we have given free passes to many of our potential partners who are avoiding conducting direct dialogue with member states over giving something regionally, the contribution regionally. During my brief time within the ministry, I've seen non-resident ambassadors, Canberra-based ambassadors, coming over to my capital, seeing more foreign missions than state missions. State institutions, sorry, than state institutions. When I speak to them, they said, our contribution are basically going to the regional organizations. So the engagements more or less tend to be defeated when it comes to things like that. For us, we also have even the European Union moving out of the Solomon Islands, shifting out to Suva. Now we are covered regionally. So basically when you move out, it's nearly like out of sight, out of mind, and the relations is basically by remote control from abroad. We're trying to bring all this back, but I think the whole regional architecture somehow needs to be looked at in terms of correcting some of these things. Let me now turn to climate change. Climate change, well, for us, the Pacific, when you look at the Pacific and the Paris Agreement, agreement adopted in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, also in 2015, as well as the Addis Ababa Agenda, all these are basically the Pacific's first and last line of defense in guaranteeing their survival. I say this in a way that it calls for new global calls for a new way of doing business, and if we are going to avoid a runaway climate change from reaching its tipping point or point of no return, which is basically in a few years time, this is basically the Pacific's worst fear in being, not only because of its location in some of the world's climate hotspot, but where the impact of climate change is basically 3 times the global average. The window for addressing climate change is fast closing. For us, basically, we're talking about ocean acidification. We have already passed the safe limit of 350 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide concentration. We're already at 402 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide concentration. coral begins to dissolve at 500 parts per million. And the shift from the safe level to where we are now is just within the last couple of years. It's not even, it's less than 10 years that we have done that. So if we look at what science is telling us, we're basically close to reaching that tipping point. And once that happens, basically we're dealing with a crisis within the region. And this is why I think the Boer Declaration, the way we define security, we try to define it from with a broader definition to include food security, water security, and so forth. We have also relocated populations from low-lying islands, especially in the Solomons, to high-raised islands. The fertility of the land that they're working on is reducing every year. So eventually they will have to encroach in the neighbor's land. And this is where this warm war against climate change becomes a hot war. And that also is something that we see climate change within the region as not only a threat multiplier, but it basically is something beyond the capacity of the Pacific countries to deal with it. It basically needs everyone to come on board. So when we look at the Paris Agreement, what does it say for us? The ambition to put us on that safe level is not there. We are currently heading towards a 3.7 to 4 degrees world. The ambition is so low. That in itself, as we speak, it's basically a death sentence for the island countries. The future of the world rests on global cooperation, and for us, everyone needs to do their fair share. Everyone needs to do their fair share in terms of stepping up on the commitment by 2020. So by next year, if we don't see ambition rise to put us on that 1.5 pathway, which we consider safe, then basically the Paris Agreement is dead. This is the reality that is before us. So we know if the Pacific cannot be saved, then basically being on the front line, humanity and the rest, basically the rest of the world will also follow similar path. But I think we know that with cooperation we can do something. So this is why whatever cooperation now comes bilaterally, comes multilaterally, more should be done on mitigation. Because eventually we will focus less on mitigation and more on adaptation. And eventually once adaptation, we can do so much adaptation, but there will come a time where adaptation will end and loss and damage begins. And that's where for us, this is where some of our islands we have already lost. And we will continue to lose more. But I think the reality is we need to keep fighting this fight to leave something better for our people. But so all this, what does it calls for? Right? It calls for new political relationship, and this is why I think the new foreign policies that are coming through are exciting for us. The Australian Step Up policy in terms of looking at partnerships differently, looking at big transformative partnership and so forth. This is heartening for us. But two goals must be the target in terms of looking at that. First is for us to create an economy that is owned by the countries. Secondly, to create homegrown private sector. Because when you look, and thirdly, to put every Pacific Island countries on a middle income pathway. Some of us are graduating out of have already been listed to graduate out of the LBC status. but it only needs a disaster to wipe out all the investments that we have made to be where we are today. So this is, I think this is something that in terms of trying to build that resilience, we need to try to build that from within. New partnerships have to be big, people-centered, and for many of us, especially many of the island countries, not so much every investment in capital. It has to go out to provinces. These are where 80% of our populations are located. The shift of focus leads to, while all this shifting is happening, the core interest of the Pacific has never changed. It has never changed in terms of, we have always placed priority on infrastructure, we have always placed priority on renewable energy, we have always placed priority on fisheries, we have placed priorities on tourism, the productive sector, really. So we need that sort of investment in terms of preparing our population for what is to come. And in particular, I wish to dwell a little bit more on energy. Energy is basically, this needs to happen. We are doing one of our hydro in the Pacific, in the Solomons, Tina Hydro. We did it not with support from the region. We basically did it bilaterally, going out to the Green Climate Fund and trying to get the support that many of our partners, including Australia, have put money into. And I think this is why probably we are asking the region to think big in terms of looking at some of these things. It is basically nearly a $200 million project. And I think this is why, if the projects and the outcomes of many of the Pacific continues to be small, it will be too small to keep up with our development needs. Now, on climate change, on renewable energy, nearly a third of national budgets of many of the Pacific countries are all spent on fossil fuel. If we correct that, we can free domestic money to go into other sectors. We are pleased to see the Coral Sea cable system that is being done that is done in partnership with Australia. The 250 million infrastructure development partnership that Australia recently announced with Solomon Islands. These are game-changing projects that we really want to work on. But I think let me just turn to I think more focus going forward is basically on trade. The PERSA Plus is a vehicle for us to tap into. But if we don't have hot air facilities, fumigation, laboratories, and so forth, it'll be difficult for us to trade. We've been asked to, even amongst the Pacific Island countries, we have been asked to supply certain agricultural products, but it cannot move without biosecurity in place. And I think these are some of the new investments that we would like attention to be paid to. The labor mobility is another area in which it remains a Pacific priority. But I think when we look at that, we really need to try to link it with education in the Pacific, trying to get Pacific University accreditation that can be recognized here in Australia to enter the Australian market. So there needs to be some sort of cooperation also at educational level. Of course, we have the APTC that is operating within the region, but I think also we need to extend it beyond to our national universities. In the case of Solomon Islands, we see 100 nurses graduating every year, and only 20 find jobs. 80% are basically left on the side It's just basically 20 because we have 20 retirements, or within that retirement, deaths in which vacancy emerge over time. But so I think the scope in terms of expanding a lot of these things are great, but I think we just need to see we can expand it further if more cooperation directly between universities in Solomons and universities here in Australia and including New Zealand. Finally, I just want to say that we must learn from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, basically because all the goals, when we see that, they are all social goals. All social goals. And it has, none of the Pacific actually has achieved everything, all the MDGs. And this is probably one of the reasons why the SDGs are there, the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to, whatever we do, now we have to look at the three pillars, the economic, the social, and the environment pillars in terms of creating a highway of partnership to roll this out. So with that, I just wish to this workshop really every success, and in our deliberation, and I thank you very much for listening to me. I'm open for questions if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Collin. That was fantastic. We do have a few minutes for questions before morning tea. So if I could ask you to, when you're given the microphone, please identify yourself. And Tess, I recognise you. Tess once said something very wise when she was chairing a session. If you've got two questions, pick your favourite one and ask one question. So, yeah.
Thank you, James, and thank you for accrediting that wise words and not just appropriating it for yourself. Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary, for your words. I was struck by your comments on regionalism, and based on work that I've done, and as we know, the key characteristic is one of the voluntary nature of regionalism. And you also made reference to the Boyd Declaration, which is one of the most recent expressions of regional thinking. As we know, that is being developed into an action plan for delivery on the Boyd Declaration. So my question is, do we need to do away with voluntary regionalism and use the Boyd Declaration and what comes out of the action plan? Does that need to be made into something that's a bit more, has a bit more accountability, where all signatories to the Boyd Declaration, including those that don't talk about how they're signatories to it, are called to account as to how they measure up to what it includes and what the expectations are?
Thank you. Well, I think when we look at regionalism, really we are putting money into it. It's not a question of no money. It's basically trying to ensure that it is targeted and have something on the ground that people can feel, see, and touch. At the moment, you know, when you look at regionalism as we speak, you have annually and once a year leaders coming together talking about an agenda that not necessarily of the making. We have gone away from the original spirit of cooperation. We have gone away in the sense that now it's so structured. Prime ministers, leaders tend to read according to briefs, presenting statements. This space of just talking about their needs are not there. This is why I think we have outsourced a lot of discussions into other sub-regional arrangements or in other groupings. But I think that honest discussion is no longer there because We have probably tried to put them into a straitjacket, and at some point we just need to tell them. We just need to tell the way we look at things. Tell our regional organization, don't put too many agenda. Let us ask each leader to put one item. We will be surprised that a number of these items will be the same. And like I said, it will be really about infrastructure, it will be really about fisheries, it will be really about tourism, it's basically about renewable energy. Their priorities are there. So that while things have changed, the interest of giving a better life for the people has not changed. So I think it's just ensuring that these regional organizations somehow look at these issues. If we need to build more medical schools, let us build more medical schools, but we're not talking about that. It's not happening within the regional circle. So I think it's trying to ensure everything that needs to happen is driven, owned by the members of the region.
Good morning. Thank you, Permanent Secretary. My question is with regards to your remarks about climate change, and you explained that the Pacific Small Island Developing States working together as a bloc are leading global efforts to really raise ambition to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement that has been signed on to by all nations. And my question is, the Pacific Small Island Developing States put out a statement at last year's global climate negotiations talking about sorts of ambition that's required, and said there must be no expansion of existing coal mines or the creation of new coal mines in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The UN Secretary General meeting in Suva with Pacific Island leaders a few weeks ago said that we must phase out coal-fired power. There can be no coal-fired power stations from 2020, so from next year. And the UN Secretary General is convening a conference in New York in September and asking countries to come with more ambitious targets under the Paris Agreement in order, as you put it, if they don't bring ambitious targets, we will kill the Paris Agreement. So my question is, as we know, the Australian government is currently promoting coal-fired power and has said that it won't revisit its Paris Agreement targets. So are you expecting more from Australia in terms of mitigation of climate change? And would that help with Australia's Pacific step up?
Thank you. Well, I think when we talk about climate change, it's basically a life and death situation for us. We really want everyone, including our immediate neighbors as well, Australia, to do their fair share. To turn things around with climate change, it's not a question, like I said, it's not a question of no money. There is sufficient resources available to go into renewable energy. There is sufficient technology to change all these things. But I think it needs that political will. And for the Pacific, we do not have that much leverage except the moral voice. We basically try to put the human face on climate change. This is all we have. We can say things, but if the United States, for example, does not want to do anything with climate change, for us, when you talk about that sort of friendship, it's a friend, but a distant friend. Because when you know knowingly that this thing is going to happen, I'm not too sure how you define genocide. You basically knowingly know that people are going to die, but you allow that to happen. Science is very clear on that. And I think this is why, to me, I'm talking about the death of the Paris Agreement if we don't step up. And if nothing happens, no real climate action does happen, then basically, we need to find another word, but the only word I'm looking at is basically genocide, because we know we're going to kill people, and we are, going with it with the science that is telling us, and we still do it. So I think it's basically trying to urge everyone to do this, not for just the Pacific, but for humanity. I think this is basically where we are. Because once we reach that tipping point, that's it. We're just we go into a crisis mode in which survival of the fittest does happen, and this is why we might be revisiting the sad part of history that we should never go back to.
I would just have one more before morning tea, because we're cutting into our time, but yeah.
In defense of the United States, I work for the United States Embassy. An agreement is an agreement, but action is what we need. In 2017, the United States reduced their carbon dioxide emissions by 6%. One of the largest nations in reduction of carbon dioxide. I'm not going to call to the table nations that may be sitting in this room that did not decline their carbon dioxide emissions. But the reality is that you can sign on to an agreement. We need these countries to take action. The United States is taking action, but we are in the same boat as Australia, where we depend on coal and we have lobbyists, and it's going to take a mind shift, and I totally agree with you. It's going to take the political will of all of these countries, all of our countries, to tackle this problem together. But I just wanted to reiterate that an agreement, you can sign on to an agreement, but you need to take action based on that agreement.
Thank you very much. Like I said, Paris Agreement is basically our first and last line of defense. If it fails, unless we come up with another arrangement, then we will have some faith. But we must, I think the only thing is, we will try to keep doing this fighting. But at the end, history will judge us. And that, I think, is something that we will leave, this is something that history will judge us, whether we're doing sufficient or we're not doing, we're turning a blind eye to the climate change. But we thank all countries who are trying to do something. But I think we are asking and pleading and praying that everyone does more than what they're doing at the moment. The saddest thing is we're spending more on wars than on dealing with climate change. If climate change is a bank, we would have bailed it out, with the financial crisis we had. But unfortunately, we do not see it that way, and this is why I think we're trying to say there is a human face to it, and we're there to try to keep waving and saying that let's save humanity, save the Pacific, save humanity.